Good morning and welcome not only to a new Sunday morning of the Life class, but the first Sunday of our new year 2025. And there's a couple of things that make today really special. Number one, we have someone that's a very special new person in our class, and maybe new people listening out there for the first time. I hope so. We have sort of a group of about 65 to 70 people right now, which I think is pretty great for the completion of our 90-day pilot program. We've completed our 90 days, which was kind of an experiment to see how the life class would go. And just to repeat, we are the first React Lift, LYFT program that is a satellite campus of a world famous program that has offshoots all over the world, in the United Kingdom, in Asia, in India, in China, for a company based out of Canada created by Dr. Tim Fletcher, who has become quite prolific in his studies over the last 20 to 30 years. A former pastor, he is probably one of the world's leading researchers into why we turn out the way that we do, why many of us have suffered tremendous spiritual and emotional and physical abuse early in our lives. And guess what? It's never too late. What can we start doing about it right now? And so I have been so fortunate to be able to train directly with Tim, his wife, the other facilitators very intensively over this past year. And we're so pleased that here at Woodmont Christian Church that we can offer this kind of wonderful classroom facility. For those of you who have not been able to visit us, each week we'll provide these audio podcasts to you. So I did want to congratulate you all for completing the first 90 days, maybe on audio, maybe here. And for those of us in here, probably not anybody listening who would fit this description, but we self-critical perfectionists often enter a new year thinking about, oh gosh, what did I not do? Look at all of these things that I am going to do in this new year. What are all of these things I have to make up for? What are all these little mountains of goals and resolutions? Not a good idea. What I started doing several years ago was this. I would look back at the pictures that I took of the preceding year, and I would kind of look pretty much at each one and go, what does this show that I learned? What does this show that I completed? What trip did we take? What plant did I grow? What person did I reach out to? And before I knew it, I was probably into the spring. I felt better and better and better. I had lived a life, and then I took to it with a spiritual focus. And I was praying without knowing it. Oh God, what you brought me through. Oh, what I was protected from. Oh, I thought I would never get over that virus, and I did. Oh, thank you for that nurse that refilled my prescription. I felt like I was going to die. And my focus changed entirely. So, you might think about that or not. But even if you don't want to do that, get this. What I'm doing is bringing out probably a 6-inch stack of paper and files that represents all of the information that this class has learned in the last 90 days. This is stunning. You have completed a master class based on the 12 needs, based on the emotion wheels, and based on probably 10 to 12 very in-depth podcasts of information. This is a massive amount of information. It's a foundational course of information. The feedback you've given me is amazing too. Now, let me just sort of unpack this. I'm pulling off masking tape, all these folders, just to take just a few minutes, maybe 5-10 minutes, to tell you where you have been on your journey. Last September, you showed up not knowing what in the world the life class was going to be about, and I gave you an orientation to what the 12 needs are for a human being, the physical, emotional, and spiritual. And you had to do some really hard work about recognizing that certainly not all of these were met, but that perhaps you didn't have many of them met at all. And you had to look at the question that, how did I even get here with these limitations? And then you had to become familiar with something called the feelings wheel. You had to kind of say, I'm going to come back to this class and maybe look at my feelings for the first time and how to read this. I gave you this as a navigational instrument. And then not only that, you had to sign on to start looking at the brain, the parts of the brain, and get into science-based stuff. The limbic brain, the cerebral cortex, and learn about how to tell the difference when you're in what part of the brain and how that works. And that was right off the bat. And you kept coming back to the class. And that was just the beginning of September. And then after that, you heard about the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, who's provided most of the research for Dr. Tim Fletcher's learnings and textbooks. And Dr. Gabor Mate offers us this cheerful and yet absolutely true promise. And he says, we finally have the words. Now we're gathering the tools. We have hope for healing for ourselves and others. And he also says, trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And we are all so unique and totally different in the ways that we are put together as children and how we lay down the things that happen. And then I gave you an overview of 60 different characteristics in life that you may demonstrate or observe in others. A very long list. And then we decided we would just pick out a few of those and take a deep dive into those. We talked about manipulation, the signs, the causes, and types of manipulation. You had the courage to sit here and identify ways in which not only were you manipulated, but in order to survive, ways in which you picked up manipulation, just in order to navigate your way through the world. We talked about the ways in which the emotional needs of babies are met or not met, and how it might have been in your case. We talked about things such as perfectionism and how this may have manifested in your life and still just bug you to death and get in your way, ways in which it has served you well and ways in which it has not. We've talked about how people check out of life, how they escape through fantasy, whether this is digital through an addiction, whether this is being up in their head all the time and not able to be in the present. We talked about a big one, the fear of abandonment, how that starts, where it comes from, how we project those onto their relationships. Look, I'm only halfway through the stack of what you guys have done. Oh, here was a big one you loved. Why is it so hard to love ourselves? That inner critic is responsible. How does the inner critic come about? Giving our inner critic a name, a personality. We learned how to give it distance from ourselves so we could spot it coming. And then as we approached Thanksgiving last year, we approached Advent, the theme of hope, the light coming into the world out of darkness. And we began to weave some wonderful prayers and images into our lessons as we approached the anniversary of the Christ child and our different celebrations, no matter what our religious background or not. We began to feel a sense of community in this room. Then we talked about wanting to hope, but being afraid to hope. And we gave a definition of hopelessness: the culmination of the many negative expectations a person has toward himself and his future. When we have been so down for so long, and so many bad things have happened, how we lose hope. And we really talked about depression, and we talked about feelings of hopelessness. And we just got down to the brass tacks when everybody else was, oh, cheery, Merry Christmas, warm little fireside family. We talked about the flip side. We talked about the fact that everybody's just not happy and that it's lonely and that it's extremely painful. Every family having their problems. And we talked about some tools on how to survive and thrive during our own holidays. We talked about our values, really getting down to what our values were, how to hold on to those values, develop boundaries around our values through the holidays. Many of us traveling, going out of town, being with our families for the first time. And then we had two parts really looking at our insecurities, our internal insecurities and how those have developed, and our external insecurities, particularly when triggered by others, perhaps in our families. So, wow, you feel a little bit better about yourselves? And I want to give you a big thank you for hanging in here with me, because with any new endeavor, it is something new. And even though I have been in the counseling field or deeply around it in some kind of training for almost 50 years, I am open to new things that I learn every single day. And where I learn it is from you all. Those are the best lessons. Those are always the very, very best lessons. I'm not saying that academic learning and teaching and statistical experiments and all of that does not have its important of place, but real living and the truth of what really occurs in the present is where it's at. And it's my hope for you that as we start this new series I'm going to tell you about, that you have great realistic hope. We are going to start a new series on reparenting. Now, if you don't know what that is, often I will meet with a person and they'll make a comment like, well, I missed the boat on that. Well, I didn't get the manual for that. Or it's too late for me. Or, well, what if I wasn't taught that? And I'll just say, you just missed a building block. You just didn't have this. Let's begin to reparent. I was so blessed to have people that were able to give me this in my adult life and be able to do this and teach me how every day that I could do this for myself. And I want to pass this along with you. Tim Fletcher had the same experience. He and I are so aligned in our beliefs. If I had not seen thousands of people transformed, I would not tell you if this were not true. But to almost go back to the womb, in a sense, and start over, we have neuroplasticity in our brains. And then if we have an openness of heart or a faith to trust the process, religion or none, this is what it takes. because we have so much love within ourselves if we can only learn to apply it correctly. And then there's of us who have been through this process. We get this. We absolutely get this. I have had people who have been my mother figures for me that I was able to so securely attach to that I don't suffer from what I suffered from for years. People who were able to let me securely attach to them, just for example. So I don't think anybody ever gets perfect. Anybody ever gets just maybe just exactly what they need from their parents. We're humans, humans are fallible. The only infallible is God. So, just tell it like it is. And yet, those of us who have come from complex trauma situations, we really did not get what we needed in various, if you look at those 12 critical needs. We have difficulties that some people who would describe coming from pretty healthy homes and don't demonstrate some of the sensitivities that we have in life. We need to find people that are of our own kind and understand these things. It's like I said last week, when one of us needs a lot of reassurance, we understand needing a lot of validation and a lot of reassurance. Someone who doesn't have this particular background might think, oh, get a grip, blow it off. And we're horribly offended with good reason. So this is a very specialized group of the healing arts. It requires tenderness and mercy and patience and a lot of scientific knowledge that is not very well known. And so this is where we're going with this. So what we're going to do today is to just sort of introduce the science of reparenting very slowly. I have weeks and weeks and weeks of lessons prepared on reparenting, and it's going to be like we'll all start out like right here at the bottom. We all start in the very same place, and we all start in community, and all of these will be recorded. So if you miss one, don't worry. It'll be put right back in here. So these are things that are not really known by most people. So instead of telling yourself, oh, I'm just a baby, I'm behind the 8 ball. No, you're ahead. These are things people don't usually know. Think about this as not only the fresh start to 2025. Think about this as a new, clean chance at a clear soul, a higher self, your best version. How would it be if people could really do that to reparent? I can tell you at almost 70, there's no way at a teen or 20 that I have ever felt this clear and clean as a personal testimony. This stuff really, really does work. But you need to do it consistently, and you need to begin to trust a process. It's not about becoming perfect. Perfect is nothing. It's about becoming you. It's about becoming who you were created to be. And as you become more you, as I become more me with all of my little quirks and my idiosyncrasies, and all of the little things that just make me me, I become lighter. I become filled with more joy. I don't think about pleasing people. The pleasure I give other people just simply comes from joy that is contagious. I don't feel pressure like I used to. Somebody nod if I'm making sense. They're all nodding, podcast audience, they're all nodding. I hope you are. I hope a few of you are. So we're going to switch to a kind of second piece now that we've completed our first 90 days, and to understand that in healing complex trauma, a great way to look at it is reparenting yourself. So the complex trauma itself comes as a result of the child not being parented as well as they should have. And in some cases, that's an understatement. Certain needs were not met by their parent. That causes the child to not feel safe, to not feel loved unconditionally, and that's what we need. We need unconditional love and acceptance. So there's a term that came into being before complex PTSD, and they used to call it developmental trauma disorder. If some of you have been through sort of the psychological world a long time ago, you may remember that this was thrown around. And so, of course, it was understood that a child's basic needs weren't met during a particular developmental time of the child's life. And so part of that child got stuck. All this stuff was around in the 60s and 70s. And the child sort of got trapped or stunted. There was a TV show on not long ago called Arrested Development. And tragically, it was a dark comedy, and there was nothing funny about it. The child felt traumatized at that time. So that's what we're going to be looking at, is the effects of developmental trauma that take place within a complex trauma situation. So once we do that, we can look at the reparenting that we have to do within ourselves, that we can do and learn to do in order to heal and grow. So a lot of it is looking at it very specifically. What did I not get now that I've looked at my pain? And there may be two things that we need. What I found in my life, and then what is generally prescribed is the very same thing, is sort of a surrogate parent. I mean, it can be somebody younger than you that just has the qualities of unconditional love and acceptance. Mentors in your life. So that's an outside thing. And then the internal thing is changing the internal parent in our brain, which is always that inner critic. Very unhealthy. Get it healthy. Be patient. Get it healthy. It's a journey. It's taken me a long time. So that we can parent ourselves in a healthy way. Now, there's a big problem here, because when a child biologically comes into the world, the first time as an infant, they can kind of come in, as a clean slate. And with healthy inclinations, they have the inclination to trust, to be authentic, and to love. They have that little open heart. And so that's one thing. But we have wounded hearts we don't trust. It takes a while to trust. It's the main thing. It's trust. I've said before in this class that I remember times, many times in my life, when I thought, well, that proves that you could trust no one. I am the only person who is trustworthy in this world, and I will let no one in. And I built walls of steel around myself. Many, many times. And a lot of that was almost subconsciously. I might trust somebody to come over at the store and say, can I help you today? I mean, something like that. But even then, I was very, very suspicious and very hypervigilant for many, many, many years. So reparenting a child who doesn't trust and who feels that being authentic is not the way to go. It's kind of like, I've shown myself, and look what happened. I'm not doing that anymore. And then now I have these wounds. So we have to look at what the foundation blocks are that a child needs to have a healthy life. And then if they have those foundation blocks in there, what are the stages of growth? How did they develop as children? And so what we want you to be able to see is that if you have complex trauma, and if you don't have some, you won't be interested in listening to these podcasts, try to spot the foundation blocks that were not part of your life. What blocks were you missing? Or spot the development stages that didn't take place in your life because you didn't have the right foundation. We talk about people that will just have these missing years somewhere, or they felt like they were play acting through certain series of years through their life, or they'll feel like maybe another sibling is sort of the golden child in their family, and that they were totally, off the parents' radar during that period of time. And so we can work on those building blocks and then see what healthy growth looks like as we reparent ourselves. I know that even in my 50s and 60s, I have done this work within things that I missed. So just to encourage you, this is a growth process, and I'm in this field. So this is about being human. This is not about being deficient in anything. This is about, especially if you've been in a caregiving position, or a position in which you were not seen, you were not heard, or especially if you grew up in any kind of a home with an ism, alcoholism, workaholism, internal spiritual malady home. We're still doing this as adults. But researchers have found that developmental trauma affects a person, the child, in 7 different areas. Number 1, it does affect the somatic, or the body, sensory issues in the brainstem. And this was huge for me because it explained a lot. It makes them more sensitive to light and sound. So I was diagnosed with cortical brain spasms about 15 years ago, because certain types of light and high volume sounds would just send me into a seizure. And when finally, after a bunch of neurologists diagnosed that and then put it together with the trauma research, it was just like, okay, God, how are you going to use this in my life? And it was years before they got a shot and I could get off the antispasmodic, and now it's great because I could take a shot for it, but it was so trauma related, and they had picked up on that in earlier years. But this is one thing that I'll just disclose to you that, I've been through physically myself about how trauma manifests in the body. And there are so many people who have found out that indeed, as Bessel van der Kolk has said, our issues are in our tissues. If you all have not read Body Keeps the Score, it's just one personal example. I don't mind sharing anything personal with you all because I feel like that that often where it's appropriate is the very meaning of what happens to us, so that other people can learn and discuss and gain confidence when you find out that something really is true. But it changes our 5 senses. In that case, it was light and sound. It affects different bodily functions because the trauma affecting their nervous system, their immune system. And it also affects attachment. And it also affects our ability to connect. It also affects our ability to regulate our emotions. And we're going to see how important these things are as we go forward. And fourthly, it affects our ability to regulate our behavior, mainly our impulses. And then it affects our self-esteem, how we see ourselves, how we see our identity. And then it results in a tendency also to do something called disassociation, to just disconnect from ourselves and our environment. And I had that big time. And then it can also affect our cognitive abilities. So we see this a whole lot. Um, Again, I have many, many examples of this where learning problems, sequencing, ADHD, the research is just hefty volume. I have many, many stories of personal cases. And developmental trauma has a profound effect. So those are 7 areas that in that little soup bowl, what I just gave you, these are 7 areas where there's tons and tons of research, but those are basic 7. Now, I'm not saying that there are not physical factors and other things that, could not have been environmental or a early concussion or, yes, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that the roots of trauma developmentally have a big impact on the likelihood here. So let's start looking at this from the psychological development process. Anybody in here ever heard of Erik Erikson early psychology class? Or it's great if he's new to you because this is fascinating, and I won't I won't dwell on this overly long, but it's just amazing if you can just kind of look back at your life. Most people just kind of like go childhood, adolescence, then I went to college or went to high school. But it's a lot more detailed than that. I mean, we are just such uniquely created individuals. But Erik Erikson, who was a very, very famous scientist and psychologist, laid out the stages of how our psyche actually develops from childhood on. And many people will ask me, well, what does healthy look like? Well, here's a way in which you can begin to start to answer that question. And also where healthy can go wrong. In the first year of life, as an infant, as I told you, that main building block is trust. And if there's not trust, then the crisis is mistrust. So the favorable outcome that happens when a child is in a healthy home, baby comes into the world with a natural inclination, clean slate, to trust, is now they trust their environment is safe, they trust their parents are going to keep them safe, they trust they're going to provide their needs, they're going to keep their promises. And that enables them to do something called securely attached to their parents in a healthy way. So that's why trust is the first building block. It's made or broken in the first year. Mainly the unfavorable outcome is if trust is not built into the child's life or something that happens that causes it to be jeopardized. Then that child has difficulty trusting. The child has difficulty trusting. They now have fear as the common emotion. Suspicion. They're not able to attach in the second year. When I was born, there was some sort of horrible, I don't know, they made it sound like the bubonic plague, some kind of horrible flu in which, the way the story goes, I was snatched from my mother's arms and she could not touch me for 3 weeks. So I missed any of the breastfeeding and I was some caretaker with a bottle. And then they, like I say, I'm only sharing this with you because I'm giving you a personal example. My parents were still in student housing, even though they were not students, they were both chaplains to a university system, but they were still living there temporarily. And the little lady that ran the building was a crotchety little old woman, and she would not allow children there. And they were building our house, but it was severely delayed. It was the middle of winter. It was Christmas time. And so she made it very clear that if the baby came, they were to be out, out on their noses, whether the house was ready or not, and there was not money for interim houses. So after all of this separation, weeks of separation from my mother, they decided that they were going to sneak me in, because I'd been a very quiet baby, because I'd had no interaction, in a detergent box, a Tide box to be exactly. So can you see this horrible, end of January, early February snowfall in the 1950s, and they snuck me in the back alley by the coal bin and up a flight of stairs, and I was not allowed to make a sound again for, I don't know, it was months and months and months. So, even though I was very loved, I know that intellectually there was all of this. And when we got in the house and I began to cry, my parents weren't used to that, and they were much older. So I'm sure there were many looks of irritation and like, what's that? What's that noise you're making? Which I would absorb those sensory expressions. So, in working on all this for a long time, and when attachment theory really became popular, I felt like, oh my goodness, I have found a lot of truth, because it explained my early feelings as a child. So the main issue is autonomy or self-identity. And if that's not developed, then shame and doubt develop. So what we mean by autonomy is the child begins to realize that they are an individual. They are separate from others, and they can make choices about themselves. They can express needs. They can be authentic in expressing their emotions, their personality. And if they're in a healthy environment, that's going to be well received, that's going to be nurtured, that's going to be loved. And so they're going to end up with a positive identity, a positive self-image. So that's what's happening in your first year and your second year. Key building block. But if they're not accepted, and if the parents don't connect with them, and if you add in things like control, abuse, neglect, then that autonomy gets severely jeopardized. And what comes in its place, and I think probably for most all of us, as we've talked about before, is shame. And that is defined as a negative self-identity, that there must be something wrong with me. In other words, if I am banished, neglected, my sensory comforts are not met, called a skin hunger in many clinical experiences if babies don't get what they need. My parents aren't connecting with me. I must not be lovable. I must not be valuable. So people that have a lot of self-doubt, that have this kind of background, you can just see that the trust, connection, sense of identity being positive, some of those key things, it might be worth a look back as did they get these building blocks. So if you flip forward a little bit, a whole bunch of things begin to develop, negative things begin to happen in a child's life. Somewhere between the third and fifth year, Erik Erikson identifies initiative versus guilt. Okay, something called initiative versus guilt. So if a child has connected good self-identity and good trust, then they can think, okay, I can go and explore. I can be curious. I can find out about this world by trying new and different things. And she's not thinking in these words, but it's basically, wow, I can discover my talents, my abilities. I can figure out who I am by doing all these different things. Okay? And that's such an important stage for a child to be curious and to be able to explore and discover. But what happens if that doesn't happen? Then you have an unfavorable outcome, and that's a crisis. Because if the child can't do that, they really can't find out who they are because they fear failure. Because if they try to do those things and they get punished, or if they failed and they were punished for the failure or shamed, now the sense of guilt. So you see, instead of initiative, like, good boy, go outside. It's great you found the creek. It's great you found the bugs. Let's look at it. Let's learn about the bugs. Let's do that. It'd be like, I can't believe you got those Sunday school shoes dirty. We didn't know where you were. Get back in here. Contrast these two kind of things. You have good for you initiative, or you have shame for guilt. Why'd you do that without permission? Whatever that might be. So a sense of inadequacy and shame and fearfulness growing up can come from that. So there's a ripple effect that can go into the rest of life if not addressed. Now again, any of these things can be caught and can be turned around and addressed. But sometimes just the way life goes, we have no clue that we're even driven by these things. So if a child has the freedom to initiate exploring and being curious and developing an understanding of who they are, from the 6th year on to puberty, Erik Erikson identifies the next main thing as something called industry versus inferiority. Industry versus inferiority. So in a healthy home, what's happening in a child is that they're not just learning about themselves, they're learning skills for how to have a job, how to organize their understanding. They're learning different skill sets in order to do different things. It could be sports, it could be music, it could be social skills. So their world is expanding beyond understanding themselves so that they can understand how to relate in healthy ways. So that's setting them up for good relationships in the future, how to have a job in the future, how to do well at all of that. Greater understandings, greater skills, more tools. So what happens if a child is not getting any of that? Well, and I'm thinking about one fella in particular. He's probably in his early 30s right now, and his main thing, that he says as he's in a recovery program, my dad just said, figure it out, and just left me totally on my own. And he said, if I had just learned things, if I had just had somebody to just show me step by step how to do things, I would be a different man today. And so now he has male mentors, and he approached them and said, I need help. I need you to teach me how to fish. I need you to teach me how to do woodworking. I'm going to take a class in this. And he's having great joy equipping himself. No more am I going to feel inferior. So he's just, my friend is a great example of it's never too late. So, he's just sick of having shame about not knowing how to do things. And he ceased to blame his father. He ceased to hate his father. He has forgiven his father, who was equally ill-equipped by his traveling salesman father who was not home. And it's amazing healing in his life. So there's some growing issues that are developing when the child lags behind others because the parents either don't take time, or if they can't, at least find somebody to teach their child. Then we get to the adolescent years. And we're going to finish up with that, put a period at the end of the sentence just for today. This is the crisis, Erikson says, of identity versus confusion. So if they've been growing, then they should be at a point in their teen years where they are becoming comfortable with who they are. They've sort of got a take on their personality. They know their skills, their talents, what they're good at. They're performing well. They're adjusting to society. They know what's unique about them, but they're connected to others. They have some competency. But as we'll talk about beginning next week, if there's an unfavorable outcome and things have not been going well, this is growing confusion. And this is what we see so much um, magnified so much more in the teens of today, where we have confusion about gender, we have confusion about body parts, we have confusion about social media. If we thought we had confusion growing up, look at today. Pray for the parents of today all the time. So we're going to put a little pin in that for today. I want to thank you all so much for listening, and want to end with a prayer for the week going forward, if you would. Our higher power, we thank you so much for the people that have tuned in today and those that are here. We just ask that you give us patience and kindness and tolerance with those that we find to be difficult to deal with this week. And we ask that you will guard our health and our emotional sobriety this week and bring us back here again. Amen. Good to see you all. Glad to be. You're welcome.